Coming up next on Living on the Edge with Chip Ingram.
In the new millennium, what's it look like to be a woman? What's God's design? What am I made for? How do I balance all these demands?
Welcome to Living on the Edge. We're in a series called House or Home, and we're learning God's blueprint for a great marriage. If you've been tracking with us, you learned that in our last episode, we talked to men. We talked about, is there a man in the house? Well, ladies, welcome. We're going to talk a little bit now to you. Is there a woman in the home? There's been a tremendous evolution about what it means to be a woman and what's her role and how it works and how does it impact marriage. God has a great plan for you, ladies, and today we're going to share it. Stay with me.
I was recently on a airplane and found myself, stuck in a back row, and there was a lady in early 30s, I'm figuring maybe 32 years old, and we got in a conversation about life, and I got to share Christ with her. And she had an interesting story. I mean, she was young, attractive, grad school, single. And basically the story went something like this. I've kind of watched my parents, and they're sort of old school and semi-traditional. I don't think they've ever been really happy. I'm looking at my friends. I'm 30, 32, I guess. And most of my friends have been married and have divorced once. Some of my other friends have decided they're going to move in together. I don't know whether should I move in with a guy, should I not move in with a guy? If I get married, should I have kids? If I have kids, like my parents were into that stay-at-home thing. Should I do that? But I've got a career, and I spent a lot of time getting these degrees, and basically said, so what's a woman to do? In the new millennium, what's it look like to be a woman? What's God's design? What am I made for? How do I balance all these demands? And so what I want to do is I want to take you on a little journey, because ladies, there's been an evolution of the American female in the last 40 to 50 years as well. And I want to start with something that maybe in Christian circles we don't share as much as we ought and should. It's the history of injustice. Did you know that in this country, a woman could not vote until 1920? Did you know that a woman could not vote in Switzerland until 1971? Did you know that in the 1960s, if you were a woman and just wanted to rent an apartment, in most states, you couldn't even rent an apartment unless you could get a male relative to sign for you, because we knew that you weren't really capable of earning any money and staying on top of your bills. Now, that wasn't that long ago. How'd you like to live in that world? Now we have thousands of women in all places, legislatures, senators. Our recent governor who lost was the head of eBay, multi-billion-dollar corporation. And so a lot of things have happened with women, and sometimes the word feminism scares people, but it's not a dirty word. Webster describes feminism as the principle that women should have political, economic, and social rights equal to men. And feminism is just the movement that they should have equal social, political, and economic rights. I think what we confuse is radical feminism. Radical feminism saw some of the things that I read and had this really super bizarre agenda. In fact, let me read out of the Organization for Women. This is their literature. Now is the time, forgive the graphic nature, to boot heel in the groin of patriarchy, declares Now. Now is the time to fight back. No God, no master, and no laws. That's radical feminism. That's not a woman should get paid the same for doing the same job. That's not a woman ought to vote just like a man. Growing out of that, radical feminism brought sweeping changes in education. And then sweeping changes, by the way, that have impacted how you as women and we as men think about roles and about women. Women's studies were started at Wesley College, Smith Mills College, University of Minnesota. There were just radical shifts during this time in the military. Now this is actual, okay, this is a warning label on a woman studies bulletin from one of these universities. We will help your daughter discover the extent to which she has been in complicity with the patriarchs. We will encourage her to reconstruct herself through dialogue with us. She may become enraged and chronically offended. She is very likely to reject the religious and moral values you raised her with. She may distance herself from family and friends. She may even appear quite different and change her sexual orientation. She may end up hating her father and pitying her mother. After she has completed her re-education with us, you will certainly be out of tens of thousands of dollars and very positively be out of a daughter as well. Now, that was the agenda. But the thing you need to understand about how life works is when there's a radical agenda, pieces of it seep into the mainstream. Interesting, USA Weekend did a study and survey that they've done every year. And they did it of women in the 60s, women in the 70s, women in the 80s, and women in the 90s. And it's interesting. It talks about what women want now. And it traces this radical agenda full circle where women are saying, you know something, I think family's more important than career. There's a whole movement of women figuring out how can I, you know, the 90s was we really can have it all. I can really work full time, be a tremendous mother, have a great marriage, and this amazing demand on women. And now a group of women have said, we've got to figure out, I want quality time with my kids. I want a life, and I don't know how, basically, to balance these amazing demands that are coming at me. And so what occurred during that season is something that most of you grew up in. In the 1920s, less than 20% of women aged 20 to 50 worked outside the home. By the 1960s, 40% of women aged 20 to 50 worked outside the home. By the 1970s, it was 50%, and in the 1990s, it mushroomed to 75% of women worked outside the home. So what happened to the home? So you have men being told they're getting more and more passive, and they've learned that now, you know, who's the heroes? Remember, who were the heroes in the 50s and the early 60s and even up through the 70s? The heroes were policemen and doctors and teachers and firemen. And what did they do? What were their jobs? They saved people's lives. The heroes of the last 25 years have been entertainers and athletes. And what do? They play. Remember, Michael Jordan was the most recognized figure 5 to 7 years ago of any human on the planet. I want to be like Mike. What does Mike do? He plays for a living. And then what happens emerges, then we have Tiger. So everyone wants their kids to be like Tiger. What does Tiger do? He plays for a living. When we got behind the scenes, when they weren't playing, what did Michael and Tiger do? They exploited women. And these are the heroes that men grow up with. Ladies, you need to understand that you're just not waking up one day, lying in bed next to some guy who just doesn't understand what it means to lead as a man. You are also a woman who's been brainwashed to think a number of thoughts about what a man really is, but what is a woman? So what's the result of the changing roles? The standard of living went up. The quality of living went down. Money went up, violence went up, divorce went up, SAT scores went down, teen suicide went up, and depression went up. So now the #1 prescription drug in America is antidepressants, to the most affluent people in all of history. Women got 2 jobs. You can say what you want about we're going to divide the responsibilities and all that jazz. I'll tell you what, if you're a woman, what do you know? You get up, you go to work, you have a job. When you go home, you got another job. Now, you might get a little help in the kitchen, you might get little dishes, but most women have 2 full-time jobs. They really run the home, and they've got this career. And they're tired, and they're overextended, and the major thing communicated is a low-grade nagging guilt. I don't think I'm giving my job everything I could, and I feel like in order to get ahead I need to do this, but I don't feel like I'm the mother I need to be, and I'm really concerned about that. And we don't have, I talk with couples, we really love each other. We really love each other. We only see each other on Thursday nights because he works here, here, and here. I travel here, here, and here. And then someone needs to say, and you're doing this on purpose? You married someone so you can see each other on Thursday nights, once a week? Or like the stewardess on the plane, a young gal, she spoke 4 or 5 languages and was going to get this new job where she was going to travel all over the world. And I said, well, what do your husband do? And I said, well, doesn't that mean you'll be apart a lot? She goes, we only see each other half a day on Saturdays now anyway. And I'm thinking, see, here's the part though, it's normal. I want you women to get what you have and how you think and how your men think has been a cultural revolution in the last 40 years that's diametrically opposed to the things that make for intimate marriages and great families. So guess what we have? Non-intimate marriages and disintegrating families, divorce rates that are off the charts. And if I hear of one more guy killing his wife or one sports player beating up his girlfriend, I think I'm going to choke. Because as things get crazier and crazier and crazier, now we got kids killing kids. Well, why? Kids are confused. Men got 2 incomes, women got 2 jobs, kids got too little attention. And the fundamental question is, are women's lives, marriages, and families better than before the politically correct experiment, or worse? And right now, very interestingly, both sacred and secular, if you will, women are voting with their feet like never before and coming out of the workforce and saying, you know what, I'd rather have 1 car than 2. I'd rather have 1,800 square feet instead of 3,500 square feet. I'd like a life. I'd like a life. I'd like a marriage that means something. I'd like kids that I know what's going on. I'd like to love and feel loved. And you know what, I'm going to figure out, I might have lots more years to do lots of different things in career, but this is a window of time that I don't want to give up in my kids' lives. So redefining womanhood in our marriages and homes. Are you ready? It always begins with mutual submission. Now this is going to sound like a tape that I've heard before. As you listen to this, ladies, you're going to think to yourself, I think I've heard this before. Are you mean to say that the men and the women are both to be what? Submitting to one another out of the reverence for Christ? Yes. Are you going to tell me that this is about a dance? That there's a choreographer and it's God? That God has a dance that He's created and that really it's not about who takes which step? It's about owning the responsibility and we need clarity of roles? Yes. Are you going to tell me that there's this Greek word called hupo to mean under and tasso that means to be in rank order like it's a military word? And that both of us are under the rank and order of the love and the sovereignty and the lordship of Christ. And what we come before we take the first step in our roles is with one question. How do I honor God? And how before I even know whether I take the first step or the second, whether who leads, who follows, who's responsible, who's responsive, I just need to say, how could I make your life better? How can I make you successful? I'm not trying to get my way. I'm trying to please the choreographer God, and I'm trying to love you sacrificially. That is the umbrella under which all roles are described in the New Testament. With that said, let's talk about what is the dance and the role and the meaning of submission. First of all, I want to remind you that submission is not a dirty word, that it applies to all people. It's a word that addresses structure and function, not value, equality, or importance. It's interesting that Christ submits to the Father. Remember in the garden? In the garden He says, not my will, but yours be done. We know Christ is fully God. The Father's fully God. The Holy Spirit is fully God. But there are roles even in the Godhead. Has nothing to do with value, equality, or superiority. It has to do with function. So it's really important to understand that. In fact, in your notes, I like on the bottom of the page, 1 Corinthians 11:3 says, now I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. It's about function. It's not about superiority. Christ submits to the Father. Submission is for harmony and benefit of all. Now, here, ladies, we start. Wives, verse 22. Be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, and he himself being the Savior of the body. But as the church is subject to Christ, so also wives ought to be to their own husbands in everything. Now, what word do you think you might want to circle, ladies? I'll let you go for it. Yeah, I mean that word that's been made out to be some bad, dirty word, instead of, when someone takes a step like this, if you're going to dance with them, what do you need to do? You need to follow them. When someone spins like this, you know what? If you're not spinning, it might hurt your arm. What he's saying is, I called your man to lay down his life the way Jesus laid down his life, so he's responsible to take the first step. Leaders give direction, provide provision, and protection. Now, I want you to respond to his direction. And what we're going to talk about, responding doesn't mean you take every step where he thinks it ought to go. Just as a man needs to step up, what I want ladies to understand, God says you need to step in. Men need to step up without stepping on their wives. Women need to step in without stepping over their husbands. Because a woman's greatest struggle is control. 1 Peter says that, you can win your husband without a word, and he says that's how Sarah, was this amazing woman of God, and this quiet spirit, this godliness is precious in the sight of God. But then he goes on at the very end of that passage and talks about how women fear. The reason it's hard to submit is you fear. And even in the very first, after sin, remember? The Lord speaks to Adam and to Eve and says part of the curse is you will want to control. You will want to lord. You will want to take the reins. The role reversal, the desire on the one hand to be protected and loved and nurtured is, oh yes, and the big but is on my terms, my way, the way I see it, and I want to control what goes on. A man's greatest fear is failure. A woman's greatest fear is that relationally she's going to be abandoned. And so what women do is they try and control things so they won't be abandoned, which is not a good design. And so what men do is they try to be compensating out in the workplace so they can be successful somewhere, because it's so hard to be successful at home. And so he says, ladies, I want you to submit. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, gave himself for her, that he might sanctify her by the cleansing her by the washing of the water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she be holy and blameless. God's desire is, as you follow according to his plan, it has a purifying, a sanctifying, and encouraging. Things will happen in you that can't happen apart from you following the design, even as we follow Christ. So husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies, and he who loves his wife loves himself. No one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ also the church, because we're members of his body. And then we get that design. For this purpose, right? A man will leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. And then he'll go on to say, everything I've been talking about, I'm actually talking about the supernatural relationship between Christ and his church, but here's the application. Men. He summarizes the very last verse in this passage. He summarizes, men, love your wives. Step up. Women, submit or reverence, respect, affirm your husbands. How do you do it? And before I go there, I just want to share one thing, because just in case there might be someone thinking to yourself, this is so counterintuitive. This is so politically incorrect. I mean, if I sat with some women that I know that aren't Christians and say, hey, I went to this conference and we were learning about how to make our marriages really work. And they said, well, what's the main point? What did you really learn? I'm thinking some of you would not want to say out loud, I learned that I need to step in and respect and submit to my husband. What would you get? Did you get a lobotomy before you went to that conference? Right? Now here's what I want you to get. This is really, really important. And then I'll get very practical. And then in our next session for women, boy, we're going to talk about the how-tos. This writing that you have in your hands was far more politically incorrect when the Spirit of God had Paul write it in his day than now. But for the opposite reason. See, when Paul, you may think like, submit, are you kidding? That's kind of lowering myself. Let me give you a quick picture of how women were viewed. And then let's read this passage, through a different lens. When Paul wrote this, the Jewish view of women was that they were servants and slaves. I mean, practically speaking, the Old Testament didn't teach that. In the morning, a good Jew would get up every morning and say, God, I thank you that I'm not a Gentile, a slave, or a woman. Wouldn't that just give you ooey gooey, ladies? That your husband goes, man, thank God I'm not one of those, I'm not one of those, and I'm not one of those. And though they violated the New Testament, divorce was rampant in the time of Jesus among the Jews. The Greeks moved beyond women being slaves. It was worse. In the Greek world, it wasn't a legal procedure for a divorce because it wasn't necessary. Wives cleaned the house and had legitimate children. One of their Greek philosophers, Demosthenes, an Athenian orator and statesman, said, we have courtesans or prostitutes for the sake of pleasure, we have concubines for the sake of daily cohabitation, and we have wives for the purpose of having children legitimately and being faithful guardians of our household affairs. Because Greek men found their pleasure outside of marriage, fornication and prostitution were rampant. And according to historians, Athenian society was dominated by homosexuality, lesbianism, and pedophilia, the sexual abuse of children. Ladies, when the Apostle Paul is writing about being a co-heir and saying that your husband should die for you, the Greeks viewed you as nothing more than a thing. Nothing more. You could be a thing prostitute, you could be a thing concubine, you could be a thing house cleaner to give me a son, but you're a thing. And the Apostle Paul and Jesus in their teachings are going to liberate woman in a way that now never dreamed. It gets worse. The Jews had it pretty warped. The Greeks were more warped. The Romans were out to lunch. The Romans were even worse than the Greeks. Divorce was not the exception, but the norm. Jerome, an ancient writer, tells of one Roman woman who married her 23rd husband, and she was his 21st wife. Marriage in Rome became nothing more than legalized prostitution. Rome also had rampant women's liberation movement. Women didn't want to have children because they thought it hurt their looks. Women wanted to do everything men did, and there were even women wrestlers, women fencers, and then it talks about some of the things women did that I will not share with you in our teaching time today. Pretty bizarre. Women were nothing. And Jesus said, no. Ladies, you're worth being connected to a man who's made in the image of God. And Christ submits to the Father, and the man submits to Christ, and the woman submits to the man in this context of love and value and beauty and order and structure, so that I could manifest my love and my truth to a watching world and show them the dance of relationship, where the deepest needs and greatest desires of the human heart are fulfilled and God gets glory. That's what he's picturing. Now, am I going to tell you this is comfortable for a woman of today? Absolutely not. But if you were awake when I was talking to the men, what do you think they feel like? I mean, it's a different world. I mean, you don't take, that hat that's on backwards? You take that sucker and you throw it against the wall. And you realize your hero isn't some 22-year-old making $22 million with the jersey on the back at a tailgating party going, yeah, yeah. It's amazing people are so fixated on sport because the only place a man feels like he can be a man in a woman-dominated feministic culture and where he can kind of show who he is, where he has any confidence, is usually in the area of sport or the area of work. And because we don't know what we're doing, and because we haven't had any models, and because, by the way, our flesh gravitates that way. And so God is saying, the tide has to change. One man, one woman, one marriage, one family, one church at a time, and the ball's in your court.
Isn't it amazing to see the radical revolution that's occurred in women's lives? I mean, we looked at it in men, now we look at it in women, and some things that if you were, 20-something or even early 30s, you would just think the way the world is now is the way it's always been. If you're in your 50s, you realize all the changes that have occurred, and what I want you to know, it's impacted everything. It impacts your parenting, it impacts your marriage. There's subtle pressures on a woman that most people don't understand. Now, this is only the first half of this message, and I'm so sorry, but you need to tune in next time, because the second half we talk about how God has a very specific plan to give a woman what she needs the most to feel secure, to feel loved, and to connect in a marriage that brings about her deepest heart's desires. So make sure you're with us in our next episode, and if you can't wait, go ahead and go to the website at livingontheedge.org, and there's at least the message notes that'll get you started. God bless you. Keep pressing ahead.
قناة الملكوت. تشاهدون بعد قليل مايكل يوسف وحلقة من برنامج يهديهم في الطريق.
من سيفصلنا عن محبة المسيح؟ أشدة أم ضيق أم اضطهاد أم جوع أم عري أم خطر أم سيف؟
Dans les années 70, quand j'habitais en Californie du Sud, j'ai été invité à un séminaire sur le développement. Le conférencier était un collecteur de fonds connu qui avait, à ce que l'on dit, collecté des dizaines, voire des centaines de millions de dollars pour des universités très connues. Et il a fait remarquer à plusieurs reprises que l'on peut jouer sur deux émotions pour collecter les fonds. La culpabilité et le besoin d'être apprécié. Je me rappelle que j'étais assis là-bas et que je pensais à quel point c'est contraire à tout ce que la Bible enseigne sur l'argent et le don de donner. Car notre culpabilité est déjà effacée sous le sang de Jésus-Christ. Et nous ne donnons pas par culpabilité. Car la Bible ne dit pas de donner par culpabilité, la Bible dit de donner dans la joie. La Bible dit de donner en toute simplicité. La Bible dit de donner volontiers, la Bible dit de donner sacrificiellement, la Bible dit de donner de bon gré. Et la Bible dit de donner avec enthousiasme. Mais quand vous harcelez les gens par une motivation comme la culpabilité et tous les trucs qui sont absolument contraires à l'enseignement de la parole de Dieu, le don d'argent devient une transaction et rien de plus. En fait, la philanthropie, comme vous la voyez, dans les médias d'aujourd'hui et qui est exercée dans la société dans son ensemble aujourd'hui, n'est qu'une transaction. Et voici ce que dit la Bible sur ce genre de don, car vous voyez, on le pratiquait du temps de Jésus, et Jésus disait, vous savez quoi? Ces gens-là ont déjà eu leur récompense. Ils l'ont eu ici-bas. Vous dites, comment? Eh bien, ils ont reçu les louanges des hommes, ils ont été reconnus en public, ils ont reçu toutes leurs récompenses ici sur terre. C'est ça. Je dois être franc avec vous. Le sujet de l'argent et du don d'argent en général est un sujet très délicat pour certains, vraiment. Mais bien aimé, voici ce que j'ai appris au fil des années. Celui qui considère l'argent comme un serviteur ou un outil à utiliser ne s'érige jamais quand le sujet est abordé, surtout quand il est enseigné bibliquement. Et l'un des dons du Saint-Esprit à certains dans le corps de Christ est le don de donner. Ils ne s'hérissent pas quand ils entendent parler de donner. Il y avait un pasteur de campagne dans une petite église. Il essayait d'exalter la vision et l'esprit d'intendance de son assemblée. Il commence à prêcher. Il dit, assemblée, dit-il, l'église doit passer de ramper à marcher. Et la petite assemblée a hurlé en disant, que l'église marche, pasteur, que l'église marche. Il a été encouragé, donc il a dit, eh bien, l'église doit passer de marcher à courir. Et l'assemblée a hurlé, que l'église court, pasteur, que l'église court. Il se dit, mince, alors j'excelle vraiment ici, donc il dit, et l'église doit passer de courir à s'élever dans l'air, et ça va coûter beaucoup d'argent. Et il y eut un silence absolu dans la salle. Personne n'a dit, prêche le frère. Le silence fut rompu par quelqu'un au fond de la salle qui a dit, que l'église rampe, pasteur, que l'église rampe.